And we're here tonight to start chapter 4 of Through Shade and Shadow. As always, over in the description box, you will find the link to the book on Amazon, as well as my Venmo and PayPal links in case you're feeling generous and want to drop me a couple pennies. By no means a thing I require, just something to kind of keep me fed. Um, since I am an unemployed author who is working really hard to keep things on the table and keep the rent paid. Um, the last three ones of these I've done, I've kind of shared with you some of my favorite wines. Tonight is not a wine night, however. I'm mid-edit on my next book. And I've reached the tough spot of the edit where I have to make some big decisions, and there's scenes that literally in the original draft are basically, here's the story up to here, and then a big chunk where basically in my notes it says add these two scenes type of thing. So today was a little bit of a struggle, but hey, we move on. Instead of wine tonight, I have myself a nice little glass of Irish whiskey. I'm a big Irish whiskey fan. And tonight I'm drinking Jameson's because I'm also kind of broke and I couldn't afford some of the more expensive ones that I really enjoy. So there you go. So tonight we're going to start chapter 4. And chapter 4 is once again in Alaric's point of view. And Alaric gives us an opportunity to see what's going on in the world outside of Mason's little mountain community where he's been living his whole life. So with that, I'm going to take a sip and move on. We'll start reading. This is chapter 4, Through Shade and Shadow. Alaric looked out the window of his father's office, watching the gathering throng on the ground below. Tension filled the air following the failure of the police to find the vigilantes responsible for the recorded deaths of another black man and a woman of Middle Eastern descent who wore a hijab. The videos had been posted online, picked up by news sites, and shown around the world. Similar deaths had happened in Atlanta, Detroit, and Chicago in the last week. There were rumors that the 8th Battalion was becoming an organized threat, not just a scattered ideology shared by random militia groups. "There's going to be trouble," Alaric breathed as his father joined him at the window. The mood of the crowd was fiery. Anger and fear broiled with grief and pain. Even from this distance, it was nearly suffocating him. The crowd was teeming in the space in front of City Hall, pushing it against the barricades lined with police officers. It wasn't going to take much of a spark to set off the fireworks. There was a swell of emotion and the crowd was shifting. Alaric squinted as he moved to get a better look. Behind the crowd, clamoring for justice, there was a counter-protest forming. "This isn't good," Alaric's father said beside him. The new group was smaller, but still growing. They were loud, screaming some chant he couldn't quite hear clearly enough to parse through. The front line was filled with signs with big letters spelling out exactly who they held responsible for their problems. The nearest sign had a list through a circle around it and crossed through Muslims, shades, witches, blacks, and immigrants. The first group was turning its attention away from the police and City Hall and was screaming back at the new group. "This is going to get ugly," Alaric said. "Yes, it is," Anson agreed. Suddenly his father grabbed the back of his neck and pushed him down. Alaric went to his knees, the question on his lips, but before he could ask, something slammed through the window and into the opposite wall. Outside, the yelling became screaming. Shots rang out, the measured beats of a high-powered rifle answered by scattered gunfire from automatic weapons. Alaric dared to glance up, trying to sense what the target was, stretching his gifts out as much as he could. Both crowds were running, their panic overthrowing their anger as they ran for cover. Alaric spotted cops and others running toward a building in the east, heard people screaming for help and others yelling that the shooter was a terrorist. Emotional chaos washed over him and he dropped his head back down, shaking it at his father's unspoken question. He couldn't see any clear sign of who was shooting or what they were shooting at. Anson! They both turned to the door, gesturing for the secretary to get down. She crouched and moved across the room toward them. Are you okay? Alaric nodded. It was starting to quiet outside, and he could hear sirens approaching. He eased up, peering carefully out the shattered window. There were a number of bodies on the ground. The crowd had dwindled to handfuls of people huddling together behind press vehicles and police cars. Police were moving slowly, guns drawn as they tried to find where the shooter was shooting from. His father shifted upward as well, his eyes scanning the streets. Did you get anything? Alaric shook his head. His own senses were too blown open to make sense of anything. Fear and pain reverberated through him, and he forced himself to take a deep breath and tried to retreat behind his shields, walling off the growing grief as people outside the window began to wail for their dead. Sorry, phone call. Forgot to silence the phone. There were gunshots now in the distance, and the sounds of people moving through the scene below. Radios echoing as police and emergency medical personnel began to assess the fallout. Alaric stayed clear of the window as he crossed the room. Outside the open office door, people were coming to see if anyone had been injured. Alaric stepped into the outer office to further distance himself from the chaos outside, only to be confronted by an odd mix of emotions from the people crowding in around him now. There was a flood of worry and concern, a flash of anger and fear. His hands lifted to rub at his temples, trying to block out the input. His elbow brushed someone, and the emotion coming from him was not what he expected. Where others were dripped with worry, there was a smug self-satisfaction, a thought about learning lessons. Alaric started to turn to figure out who it was, but hands were grabbing him and pulling him out of the crowd, spinning him away down the hall and pressing him against the wall, a soft barrier going up between him and the others. He swallowed and blinked, forcing his focus back inside and blinking up into Brian's worried face. He took a few deep breaths and centered himself, nodding his thanks for the reprieve. Once he was sufficiently guarded, Alaric stood up a little straighter, and Brian eased down on the mental wall. You were leaking out all over the damn place. Alaric nodded. I know, I'm not sure what happened. Brian's face softened and he took a step back. First time you've ever been shot at, so I guess it's expected. What is? Alaric asked. You overextended. How long has it been since you used that actively? Alaric glanced at the people who were close enough they might overhear, if they weren't more concerned about finding out what had happened. A while, he conceded. Well, I suggest you start practicing or this will happen again. He crossed his arms and looked over those who hadn't ventured into his father's office yet or wandered off. Did you manage to get anything useful? No, just too much emotion between me and whoever was doing the shooting, Alaric said softly. What are you doing here? Your father called me. He's inside. One of the shots just missed us. Brian frowned. Do you think it was meant for you or your father? Alaric shrugged, his eyes scanning over the remaining crowd. I didn't, but... He replayed the overheard emotion and its accompanying thought, opening up enough to share it with Brian. I'm not sure who was, though. You grabbed me before I could find him. Brian's eyes narrowed, and Alaric could sense him reaching out. Whoever it is gone, Alaric said. He kept moving. You sure? Alaric nodded. I don't sense him anymore. He pushed off the wall. I should check on Dad. Brian followed as Alaric eased past an aide and several clerks. I'm fine. Alaric is fine. Please, let's focus our efforts on the people outside who need help, Anson was saying as they entered the office. Several of the city administrative staff were there, along with Councilman Marley. I'm sure that the police will want to ask a few questions, Marley said, putting a comforting hand on Alice Hanley's shoulder. Alice, why don't you see if you can get maintenance up here to board up this window? Tom, can you coordinate with security to have a detective come up here to get Councilman Lambrick's statement? Thank you, Townsend, Anson said, his eyes finding Alaric's, checking in. Alaric sent reassurance that he was okay. Alaric moved to the window, first looking over the dismal scene where paramedics were tending to blood-soaked victims and police were still combing through buildings. His eyes moved up then to the hole in the window, not far from where his head had been only moments before the impact. Wax radiated out from the hole, spider-webbing across the glass. The hole was big. Alaric turned, tracing the likely path of the bullet, finding the spot in the wall where it had impacted. He crossed the room, ignoring the voices around him, and focused his attention on the remnants of the bullet. It wasn't likely that he was going to be able to read anything from it, especially not in the charged atmosphere around him, but he thought it worth the try. Blocking out everyone around him, Alaric extended his senses toward the wall, starting outside the hole the bullet had made to give himself time to adjust to the inherent violence he knew he would get from any connection to the actual metal. Slowly, he moved his attention closer to the actual hole, then to the metal that protruded slightly from the wall. He almost recoiled physically from the heat that hit him first, but kept steady and tried to read past it. There wasn't much left of the bullet, and nothing left of the last person who had touched it. He felt the approach of the police and stepped neatly away from the wall, moving to his father's desk. Brian's unspoken question caused him to look up, making eye contact, followed by thought, "Not enough left." Brian nodded. There was no way to know if they had been targeted or not. Alaric was inclined to think not. If it had been another act perpetrated by the 8th Battalion, they had not shown any signs that they were even aware of his kin, and if it wasn't the 8th Battalion, they had even more to worry about. Alaric finished answering the police officer's questions and stepped out of the office. It had been hours since the shooting. The death toll stood at 7, 2 of whom were police officers. The injured numbered around 20, some with gunshot wounds, others injured in fights that had broken out or by flying debris. His father was on the phone with his mother, and they were still waiting for the maintenance men to come board up the window, but Alaric needed to move. He headed down to the coffee cart on the first floor that he assumed was doing heavier business than usual. As expected, there was a line. He sighed and resigned himself to waiting, settling into line behind 2 police officers. "We need to be more careful, Minister." Alaric turned his head, startled by the clarity and loud nature of the voice. It wasn't spoken. It was a thought. He stepped back, out of the line and back against the marble pillar that was in the center of the room. He slowly scanned the room, spotting Councilman Roth near the hallway that led to the council chambers. The man with him was unfamiliar. He started to reach out, but hesitated. If this man was gifted, he'd be exposing himself. Alaric pulled his phone from his pocket and pretended to be answering texts as a cover for watching them. They seemed to be talking normally, but he wasn't sure that this was the same man he'd just heard mentally. Alaric couldn't tell what the warning had been about, but the fact that he called Roth minister and not councilman said that his purpose had more to do with the man's profession outside of City Hall, and that was concerning. Roth's church had long championed some of the strictest laws on moral issues. He was anti-abortion, anti-birth control, anti-LGBT, anti-shade, although that seemed to be a new addition to the repertoire, anti-sex, and anti-pretty much anything that could be interpreted as part of the quote-unquote liberal agenda, or that the religious right decided was against the will of God. Alaric turned his face back to his phone as they looked his way. He could feel them watching him. He thumbed a link on his phone to call Riley. He lifted the phone to his ear, smiling as he pushed up the pillar and headed past Roth and the other man. "Hey, Riley!" He kept moving, hoping they would decide he had no clue what they were up to. He snorted to himself. It was true. He knew they were up to something, but he had no clue what it was. "No, we're okay." He stepped out into the main entryway, stopping before he would be visible to the press outside. "I was just wondering if you'd be up for a visit this evening. I thought I'd stop by." "Which means you need to talk without your father listening in," Riley said with a dark chuckle. "Should I be worried?" "I don't know." Alaric glanced back over his shoulder, but Roth and his companion were gone. He sighed and shook his head. "I want your opinion on something, before I bring it to Dad." "Yeah, come on over. Abigail's got a client coming, but we can sit out back." "Great. See you in a bit." Alaric lowered the phone and put it back in his pocket. He carefully walled off his concerns and the overheard bits of conversation before reaching for his father mentally. "I'm heading over to Riley's for a while. See you at home." His father acknowledged the thought with little feedback, so if he suspected Alaric was wasn't telling him something, he'd kept it to himself. Alaric knew that it would be next to impossible to get out of the area through the main entrance, so he let himself back into the lobby and headed back towards the council chambers, taking the south hall and the private back door that only councilmen and their staff had the key to. It let him out into the shaded south side of the building, away from the chaos of the shooting, and let him bypass the cordons of police and press. He took the side road out to the main road and hailed a cab. The house that Abigail had inherited was on the end of a dead-end road, set back from the sidewalk with tidy flower beds all along the front porch. Alaric paid the cab driver and bounded up the front steps to knock. Abigail answered, one hand smoothing over her rounded belly as she smiled at him. Alaric kissed her cheek, rubbing his thoughts against hers affectionately. There was an answer that wasn't Abigail's, and he raised an eyebrow. She chuckled and looked down at her stomach. He's going to be a handful. I'll say. It wasn't unheard of, but Alaric had never felt an unborn child quite that strong. There were no thoughts, of course, just presence that let him know the child was there, mimicking the emotional waves of his mother. Riley emerged from the kitchen, 2 beers in his hands. He passed one to Alaric before kissing Abigail's cheek. We'll be out back. There was another knock on the door as Alaric followed Riley past the staircase and into the kitchen before they emerged out into the small backyard. He took a drink from the beer, wishing that it would wash away the doubt and concern flooding him. So, Riley asked, dropping onto an outdoor chair and gesturing to another, what's this about? Alaric sighed, sitting and looking down at his beer as he gathered his thoughts. He wasn't sure he could even articulate what he was worried about. Aside from the racial tension and this whole mess with the council, Riley shrugged, watching him. Hey, it's me. I'm the one who said 6 months ago that civil war was going to come, before we had any of this. Alaric looked at him. I'm sure it's crazy. He huffed and took another drink from his beer before he nodded. So, after the protest and the shooting, I was in the lobby of City Hall, and I heard something. Riley lifted an eyebrow and sat back in the chair. I take it that whoever you heard wasn't one of us? Alaric shook his head. No, at least not a face I know. And it was said to someone who I think actively despises us. That's what stopped me cold. He thought back to the moment, the thought. He said it into Councilman Roth's mind, just like I would to your dad. It was familiar, and Roth didn't seem to react. Riley frowned. Maybe he's controlling Roth? Alaric didn't think so. I suppose it's possible, but to what end? Can you show me? Riley asked, offering his hand. He put his beer down on the ground and wiped his wet hand on his pants before reaching across to take the offered hand, clearing his mind and centering before he reached out to connect their minds. Once he had a steady rapport, Alaric let the memory play several times. Riley didn't let go right away and brought up a memory of his own from the prophetic vision he'd had months before. Alaric was startled to see the same face, this time in military uniform. Whoever the man was, he would play a part in what was to come. Alaric worried at his lower lip with his teeth, a bad habit his mother had been trying to get him to break. I don't like this, Riley, Alaric said after a long moment. Not any of it. I'm beginning to think that reading Roth is going to be something one of us has to do, Riley responded. Alaric shuddered. I don't know. All that hate is bad enough. He reeks of it. I'm not sure I want any contact with what's underneath it. Riley shrugged and drank his beer. You're going to have to tell your father. Alaric shook his head. He's got enough on his plate. The protest today, the counter-protest, whoever did the shooting, the emotional fallout is huge, and there's going to be more violence before it gets better. If it gets better, Riley countered. You know there is an anti-shade rally planned for tomorrow night. Alaric closed his eyes. Where? In the park, by Roth's church. They're going to release a list of people in the community they claim are shades and other undesirables, I hear. Yeah, that should be a mess. Alaric lifted his beer, draining the last of it. Do you have any idea if their list actually contains the names of shades, or are they just pointing fingers? Riley shrugged. I haven't seen anything clearly, and Abigail needs physical contact to do her thing, but I don't want her getting involved. No, I don't either. You need to protect that baby. He stood and paced a little. We should see if we can get the list before they publish it. Abigail can give you the name of someone to start with, Riley offered. You got anything resembling a plan? Nope. Alaric pulled a hand through his hair. I am completely playing this by ear. Want to come along? Riley grinned, standing. I'm always up for some craziness. But shouldn't you have someone along with actual gifts that can help you? My random bouts of future glimpsing aren't exactly helpful. Alaric smiled and clapped a hand to his shoulder. You're coming to be my lookout. Riley didn't respond, just led Alaric back into the house, poking his head into the parlor where Abigail was sitting with her client. Alaric felt her response to the interruption, then a name floated to him, along with an image and an address. It was someplace to start. Riley grabbed a set of keys and led him out to the beat-up old Chevy sitting in the driveway. They headed out for the address Abigail had given him, pulling up in front of an unassuming small house a few minutes later. Alaric could sense at least 3 people inside. One of them was the woman they were looking for. He could see her through the window, setting out food for her husband and son. He found himself wishing he had more active gifts. Empathic ability was great for reading the temperature of a room and knowing when someone was lying or hiding fear, but when it came to reading actual thoughts, it wasn't particularly helpful. His ability to hear other people's thoughts was mostly due to his intense connection he had with his father and his keepers. He had only tried to read someone without any gifts a few times, and they'd all been volunteers who knew what he was doing. This was different. He wasn't even sure he could read anyone without touching them first. There was only one way to find out. With a glance aside at Riley, Alaric closed his eyes and stilled his mind, setting aside his anxiety and fear. Slowly he reached out for the house. Immediately he got love, dedication, family bonds that were very strong. He pushed past the emotion. The woman was tired. Her husband was focused, his attention on the boy who was recounting his day. It was the man that pulled his attention. He was disciplined, strong-willed. Alaric tried to read beyond that wall, but there was a resistance keeping him from getting more than vague impressions. He couldn't be sure if it was his own limitations or if the man had passive shields. Alaric pulled back into himself. He was shivering, sweat covering his skin, soaking into his clothes. He shook his head to answer Riley's unasked question. What do you want to do? Riley asked. What he wanted to do was knock on the door, get a hand on the man, and really read him. But he was exhausted, the day's events dragging him down. Can you drop me at home? Alaric asked, wiping his face. I'm not up for much more. Riley nodded, and they pulled away from the curb. Alaric watched the world outside his window, letting the motion of the car lull him. He didn't stir until they were outside of his house. I'll call you tomorrow, Alaric said, opening the door. We should be at that rally. Riley leaned over the seat as Alaric climbed out. You know what Brian would say. Yeah, I know, Alaric sighed. So we keep it to ourselves for now. This may be about Shades, but that doesn't mean it isn't also about us. Alaric shut the car door and headed for the house. Now that the adrenaline of the day's events had burned off, he was physically worn out. He wanted to just go to bed, but he knew his mother would worry if he did, so he made for the kitchen instead. As he took his place at the table, Alaric pushed all of his concerns behind a privacy wall in his mind. There would be a time and place when he could tell his parents about those things, but for now, he preferred to keep them to himself. And that is the end of chapter 4. And when we get to, what's today? I can't even keep track of the days anymore, guys. So today's Sunday. So Wednesday, we will move on to chapter 5 and climbing back into Mason's point of view as Mason starts his or continues his journey out into the world. In the meantime, you guys, be safe, be sane, get a little exercise, do some laundry, take a shower. Sometimes I forget the shower thing and I have to be reminded. So do those things and take good care of your people. And we will see you again in a couple of days. Keep an eye on my authors page as well. I will be doing some more live Zoom meetings for people to just kind of meet new people and talk and stuff like that. So we did one on Friday night and it was a lot of fun. So I'm thinking I'll do one maybe Wednesday or Thursday morning so that some folks from the UK and other places in Europe can join in. Um, and I've got one set up again for Friday night. So, all of that said, tomorrow's the start of a new week. Take it easy. Love you all. Bye.